Lucky Luciano was the founder of the Commission, which organized the 5 mafia families in New York. He was the original boss of the Luciano family, which is now known as the Genovese crime family. The Luciano family became the Genovese family when Lucky's underboss, Vito Genovesi, took over. Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovesi started their mafia careers working for Joe the Boss Masoria's crew. They were both influential men in the New York Mafia who had a lot of power. However, each of these aspiring mobsters took a different approach to how they handled their power. In today's video, we're going to explore the differences between how these mafia bosses handled their reign of power. We're going to talk about how they entered the criminal world, rose to the top, and the differences in how they left their legacies. Charles Luciano was born in Sicily in 1897. At birth, his name was Salvatore Luciana. There is no record of when or why his name was changed to Charles. Some people assume that the change might have occurred when his family immigrated to New York when he was 10. Like many infamous mobsters, Charles Luciano got involved in the criminal life at a young age. By the age of 14, he already had a long list of arrest records. It didn't matter how many times the young hoodlum got caught, he wasn't going to take the straight and narrow path. He got involved in a crew called the 5 Points Gang and became a leading member. This led him to bootlegging, where he worked along with another infamous gangster, Bugsy Siegel. Through bootlegging, he met Joe the Boss Massoria. Joe the Boss was the head of New York's leading crime family at the time. The crime boss saw a lot of potential in Charles Luciano, eventually promoting him to top lieutenant in 1927. At this point, the Massoria family was a major crime family in New York. Their main rivals were the Morello family, led by Salvatore Maranzano. Now, if you're familiar with notorious mafia figures, you'll likely know Charles Luciano as Lucky Luciano. Everyone called him that, but they all heard a different story of how he got this name. Lucky was known to tell various different takes on the tale. To some, he was called Lucky because of his luck with gambling. To others, he simply had the name because so many people mispronounced his last name. But the most interesting story of them all is that he was called Lucky because he escaped a brutal near-death attack in 1929. He was kidnapped by 4 men who attacked and stabbed him. They left him on a bench in Staten Island while he was still unconscious. The aspiring mobster surprisingly survived the vicious attack. Vito Genovesi was hired by Joe the Boss during the Prohibition era. Before getting involved with the Massoria crime family, Vito had already become familiar with Lucky. These 2 criminals on the rise were from around the same neighborhood. As they became familiar with one another, Lucky entrusted Vito to be his right-hand man. Vito was ruthless and ambitious, which helped him make a good impression in the criminal underground. He worked his way up to becoming the crime family's top hitman and enforcer. Vito was a skilled killer, which was a talent that Lucky was going to use to get to the top. Towards the end of the 1920s, there was a massive power struggle between Joe the Boss and Salvatore Maranzano. Both crime families were involved in bootlegging and other profitable criminal activities. They both wanted full control of the Italian Mafia activities in New York City. These ruthless Mafia figures would do anything to take control, which started the Castellammarese War, one of the most pivotal events in Mafia history. This war took place from early 1930 to April 1931 and became a bloody power struggle. Bodies were piling up on both sides. As the war went on, Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovesi grew to distrust their boss. Lucky was beginning to make connections in the criminal underworld as well. His networking paid off. Lucky was approached by Salvatore Maranzano with an offer. Salvatore was aware that Lucky lost his loyalty to Joe the Boss and wanted to take advantage of these circumstances. He offered Lucky the contract to take the Massoria crime family boss out. Lucky accepted the offer under the condition that he would gain full control of the Massoria rackets. Then he organized a hit on Joe the Boss. They met at a Coney Island restaurant on April 15, 1931. Lucky excused himself to use the restroom. Then Vito Genovesi, Bugsy Siegel, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis entered and shot Joe the Boss to death. When he accepted this contract, Lucky pledged his loyalty to Salvatore Maranzano. But something drastically changed this. Salvatore had become the boss of bosses following Joe the Boss's assassination. Lucky had been promoted to lieutenant, but his new boss had no plans of keeping him there. Lucky discovered that Salvatore had a plan to assassinate him next, so he decided to beat him to the punch. Not long after aligning together, Salvatore realized that the young Lucky and his right-hand man Vito were big threats. He hired an Irish gangster, Vincent Mad Dog Cole, to take care of them. But Tommy Lucchese was aware of the plan and tipped off Lucky. On September 10, 1931, Salvatore ordered Lucky and Vito to come to his office for a meeting. They believed that this was when he wanted to place the hit, so they arranged for 4 gunmen to take him out. With Salvatore Maranzano out of the way, Lucky Luciano was now the top boss in New York City. With that power, he founded the Commission, a syndicate that created order and control within the New York Mafia. Under the Commission, there were now 5 mafia families, known as the Bonanno, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Genovese crime families. Lucky became the boss of the Luciano crime family, and Vito was his underboss, second in command. After the Commission was formed, Lucky was living in a lap of luxury. He had a permanent suite at the Waldorf Astoria, wore high-end clothing, and entertained numerous beautiful women. All of this was highly suspicious, as it was reported that he only had an income of $22,500. Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey caught wind of his extravagant lifestyle. On top of this, a fellow mobster, Dutch Schultz, who allegedly schemed to disobey Lucky's orders not to kill another made man, was murdered. All of this led to Lucky becoming the subject of an investigation. In 1936, Lucky Luciano was sentenced to prison for prostitution and extortion charges. He still ran the family from behind bars, and Vito was the acting boss on the outside. But Vito was entangled in his own legal issues. Vito made a plan to cheat a gambler out of $150,000 with another gangster, Ferdinand Boccia. They had agreed on a rate, but after the deed was done, Ferdinand started demanding more money. Vito was a ruthless mobster who didn't stand for anyone trying to cheat or threaten him. He murdered Boccia in a coffee shop in 1934, but by the time Lucky was sent to prison, Vito was starting to catch heat for this murder. He fled to Italy in 1937, leaving Frank Costello to become acting boss, but by 1945, he was extracted back to the U.S. When Vito first arrived back in the U.S., he was wrapped up in legal troubles, but nobody wanted to testify against him. This might have been because 2 prosecutorial witnesses were found dead. Ultimately, Vito Genovese got off the hook scot-free, but he wasn't able to reclaim his old spot as easily as he thought. Allegedly, many of his former partners and accomplices were hesitant about working with him again. Vito was known to get what he wanted. He wasn't going to sit back and let someone else have the spot he worked for. If the Mafia weren't going to give it back to him, he would take it for himself. In 1957, Vito devised a plan to place a hit on Frank Costello. He arranged for a gunman, who many believed was Vincent the Chin Gigante, to shoot Frank in a hotel lobby. However, things didn't quite work out as planned. Frank survived the hit, but it was enough to scare him out of the position. The power wasn't worth his life. Once Frank Costello retired from the role, Vito Genovese reclaimed his power. The Luciano family was then formally changed to the Genovese family. There has been a lot of speculation that Vito Genovese had a plan to take down Lucky Luciano, but none of this has ever been proven to be true. However, when you compare the reigns of power, there are some qualities that would lead people to believe that the ambitious Vito may have had a master plan all along. Both Lucky and Vito left their mark in Mafia history. They were influential leaders of their time who rose through the ranks and made a lasting impression, but they were both known for vastly different leadership styles. Lucky Luciano's leadership style focused on stability. Through the Commission, he was able to put an end to one of the biggest Mafia power struggles. Organized crime families could continue their activities without drawing attention to the criminal underworld. He called the shots while Vito Genovese carried the gun. In the early days, Vito was Lucky's #1 hitman. When Lucky needed to eliminate a rival, Vito was the one that he could count on. While Vito rose through the ranks alongside Lucky, he didn't take notes from his longtime friend on how to run a Mafia family. Vito took a much different approach. Violence was at the root of Vito's power. His violent streak is how he climbed the ranks. Once he was in power, he was determined to fight to stay there. He was an ambitious man who thrived on being at the top. Vito Genovese had already shown that he could use violence to claim power through his attempted assassination of Frank Costello. But Frank wasn't the only person he needed to get out of the way. Albert Anastasia had become the boss of what is now known as the Gambino family. He ran one of the most terrifying reigns of terror that the New York Mafia has seen. Many people wanted to place a hit on him. Ultimately, Albert Anastasia was shot to death by masked hitmen at a barbershop. Who was behind the masks is still unsolved to this day. To be fair, many hitmen and gangsters have claimed to have placed the hit, but most of their stories have been debunked. However, one theory that hasn't been debunked is that Vito Genovese arranged the murder to get Albert out of his way. Now that Vito Genovese was a Mafia boss, he wanted everyone in the criminal underworld to know. He ordered the Appalachian meeting to ensure everyone in the Mafia recognized his newfound power. He summoned 100 of the most influential members in the U.S. to this meeting. Mafia members from all over the country traveled to Joe the Barber's estate in Appalachian. During this era, many Mafia members had something in common: a passion for Cadillacs. As these mafia members drove into New York, they traveled in sleek, brand-new Cadillacs. The surplus of luxury vehicles caught the attention of police. As authorities followed these vehicles, they realized immediately that something suspicious was going on. They were able to obtain dozens of mafia figures from the event, with 62 men eventually being arrested. These men were convicted of conspiring to commit perjury and obstruct justice. Vito Genovese was questioned by police, but he was let go without any charges. He claimed that he was there for a barbecue and nothing else. A year later, all of the convictions were overturned. Despite the overturning, enough damage was already done, especially to Vito Genovese's reputation. Vito had drawn too much attention to the mafia families with this event. Bosses were exposed to the public, and the media was all over this story. Before the meeting, FBI agent J. Edgar Hoover made several claims that there was no such thing as an organized mafia. All of his lies came to the surface as the public learned the truth. This was one of the biggest public embarrassments the mafia faced. Vito Genovese may have only faced public scrutiny for the Appalachian meeting, but it wasn't long until he was brought into the courtroom for real. In 1959, he was indicted for narcotics trafficking and conspiracy charges. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, Vito still ran his crime family from behind bars. Allegedly, he would order the hits of rivals and informants. When he was in prison, he allegedly had a feud with another inmate, Joe Villacchi. Joe was the son of Tommy Reina, a man that Vito Genovese killed under the orders of Joe the Boss Masseria. Joe had more than enough reason not to trust the former hitman. Their feud only added fuel to that fire. He was worried about what Vito would do, so he agreed to become a government witness. He revealed many inner workings of the mafia, which furthered Vito Genovese's downfall. Eventually, Vito passed away from a heart attack on Valentine's Day in 1969. Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese were partners in crime. Lucky had already started working for a gang by the time he met Vito. However, he saw a lot of potential in Vito, so he made the aspiring gangster his right-hand man. Together, these two had the smarts and strength to climb the ranks to the top. When comparing Lucky Luciano versus Vito Genovese, we get two very different mobster styles. Lucky was a sensible ruler. He strived for organization so the crime family could get business done without drawing in attention or additional trouble. Vito was a skilled and ambitious hitman who could take out any and every rival that complicated their operations. That wraps up our story for today. Do you think Vito Genovese was loyal to Lucky Luciano throughout their entire partnership? Or do you think he might have had alternate plans to get the notorious mob boss out of the way so he could claim the power? Tell us your take in the comments below. That's all for today's video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to see more Mafia Mystique content.